Welcome to Republican Roundtable. I am Max Reimer. Welcome back. We again are diving into our series here of the current governor's race. And with us today, we have a former governor, current gubernatorial candidate, Tim Pawlenty.
Good to be here, Max. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today.
Happy to do it.
We're back in the saddle again.
Yes, sir.
How's it feel?
Well, it feels really good. I think Minnesota's got big challenges. I think I've got some big ideas, and I think I can be a big help. So I'm looking forward to the campaign.
And up to this point, I happen to see you at the 3rd Congressional District Convention. You have jumped into the race late comparative to the other candidates. What has the activity been like? What are you up to? What are you focused on these past couple months and then kind of moving forward?
Sure. Well, of course, any campaign, you got to start with your announcement. So we did that at a cafe in Eagan, and I was glad to have that under our belt. I think that went well. The next step is to focus on sort of the respective party endorsement and nomination process. And in Minnesota, as your viewers probably know, there's a 3-step process leading to the election. One is the party endorsing convention. There's a primary in August and then the general election in November. We got in very late. The convention's just a few weeks from now, so I'm not sure if that's even realistic for us to compete in, but at the very least we'll be in the primary come August.
I'm struck, the few times that I've heard you speak, you talk a lot about, we don't know if the convention is baked, that kind of thing. Those are your exact words. I find it interesting, you jumping in so late, that you might even pursue the route of the endorsement?
Well, we're exploring it, and Minnesotans, once they pledge, they are good folks and they don't like to go back on their word. So we have some candidates who have been in the race for a year, and at least one of them has run statewide twice before. So he's been able to get the pledges for many of these delegates. So it just may not be realistic, but we're at least exploring it. But we're focused on making sure that our campaign does not stop at the endorsing convention. It'll certainly go on to the primary and I believe the general election, and we'll be victorious there.
Within that, another thing that you kind of talk about, it's a theme of your campaign, is we have an opportunity like no other before. We talk about control of the state Senate, control of the state House, and there's one more factor that we need to grab hold of. You talked, Tim, a lot about having our A-team out on the field. That to me seems a little, it's strong. It's a strong statement because I think you're conveying that you are the A-team. What about the current batch of candidates did not, resonate with you to have you jump in like you did?
Well, a few of them I met with last year, the ones that I knew and were indicating that they were going to run, and they wanted to know what I was going to do. And I said, look, if you can get traction, momentum, garner support, some excitement, or at least the beginnings of some momentum to make it look like you could be a successful candidate in a tough state like Minnesota, I'll support one of you. But if we get into early 2018 and it looks like you have still no name ID, raised very little or no money, have no sense of momentum or excitement in the broader audience, then I think we may need a stronger candidate in the field, and I'm going to consider it and get in. And that's what's happened. The other candidates, I know them, they are good people, but the fact of the matter is, they have near zero name ID. They're not able to articulate a message very strongly. They're not raising any money, and it looks like they're on a pathway towards defeat in the fall, and that's not going to be helpful.
So some of the credentials that you talked about was raising money, having a groundswell of support, that kind of thing. I know that we had Jeff Johnson, who kind of sweeped the congressional districts that he spoke to. He did a little bit of the state central, the straw polling that came by. He was at about or near 50% there. Were there specific indicators that you were looking at, or just a general feel?
Well, first of all, Jeff has run statewide and lost twice. So I don't want to repeat that again and have it be a 3-time loser with the same person. Secondarily, these straw polls are done at local conventions and have a modest number of people involved in them. So as you might imagine, in our campaign, we test the whole state with lots of people. It's a state of over 5 million people. So we're not just focused on what a few hundred people think, but what a broader audience might think about Republicans as well as people who it's going to take to win the election. And in that regard, none of the other candidates, including Jeff, have any real signs of life in them, political life in them.
Talking about 2002, 2006, the years that you got elected here, how have you seen, or how do you perceive the state has changed since you got elected? those first couple times?
Well, a lot has changed, and I got elected first in 2002, as you mentioned, and so the state is larger. The pace and scope of technology, economic advance, lots of things are happening globally and nationally, but importantly in Minnesota. And in my view, if you believe in this philosophy of lower taxes, that's gotten worse because the current administration has raised taxes. If you believe in keeping a lid on government spending, that's gotten worse. When I was governor, we kept a real lid on it, a record-setting lid on it. That's gotten worse. And again, accountability in government, whether it's work for able-bodied welfare recipients, whether it's education reform, focusing not just on how much money is going in, but what are the results that we're getting out, whether that's cracking down on illegal immigration. Those are the kinds of things that I talked about and will continue to talk about, but really the state has gone, in my view, backwards on many of those fronts.
Very interesting. And you took a step back to take a run for president. I'm curious about what that experience taught you, and what kind of experience you might take running for president into this election, if any.
Sure. Well, I think it actually is relevant to the questions you were asking just a few moments ago. I tried to run as a national candidate, not well known, having no name ID, having no real fundraising base, really just sort of introducing myself to a large audience, and realized that the scope and magnitude of that undertaking was so large and so sudden that you needed a much bigger platform or foundation to be successful at that. So one of the takeaways was, if you're going to be a successful presidential campaign, you've got to have those kinds of assets and strengths, and we did not have them in sufficient measure.
Well, during 2006, during your re-election campaign for governor, is when I first kind of really started paying attention to politics personally. When I look at the electoral map of Minnesota, let's just call it by county, that to me seems like another huge factor that has changed about this state, be it kind of ideologically shifting to a different party. You have some of the suburban areas that have gone a little bit more blue in the past couple of years. Where do you see your path to victory and your strength given that kind of shift in philosophy?
So, like you, Max, I'm a student of all of this, and I think in broad strokes, without getting into the weeds because it'll bore your viewers. But
I don't think so. We're all political nerds, Tim.
Right. I mean, so what's happened is that here's some historical facts that may be of interest to you. No Republican candidate in the state has received 51% of the vote in a quarter of a century. The last person to do it was Arnie Carlson in 1994. He was arguably quite a moderate Republican, and he was running against a fairly hapless opponent. But since then, 25 years, a quarter century, no one who's with an R behind their name has gotten 51% of the vote. Norm Coleman got 49% in a two-way race in a pretty good year. I got 46.7% in a really tough race in 2006 in a three-way race. People forget that was a three-way race. Still got almost 47%. So the Republican Party in this state has always been at a little bit of a disadvantage, at least in recent history. The Democrats usually have a 2 to 5% advantage because of the political demographics of the state. It shifts around within the state. This year, for a variety of reasons, that disadvantage for Republicans is bigger. And so we got a stronger headwind in the air, which argues even more in favor of having a stronger candidate. But what's happened is the Republican Party is doing relatively better in greater Minnesota, rural Minnesota, but at the same time that's happening, as you noted, there's been regression in the suburbs. The Republicans have lost all of the first-ring suburbs in statewide elections, most of the second-ring suburbs.
Right.
And you got to get out to the third-ring suburbs before you get into what is now reliably Republican demographic territory.
Listen, as a guy who ran in Edina,
But then the other things are happening, like Rochester and Olmsted County used to be red, it's flipped to blue. So it's not as simple as things have gotten better. People are very excited about what President Trump did here. That's, it has some hopeful signs in it.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is he still lost by 1.5%. Better, but still goes down in the column as an L.
Right. What lessons do we take away, if any? Because I really think that, and I think a lot of people tend to agree that maybe 2016 was just this flash in the pan event that happened. Do you take any lessons from 2016 about the
nobody
state?
Is Donald Trump, and that's probably not. No one can replicate that. But one thing you can take from that is
you'd have to put a little bit more tanner on. I think.
Well, maybe.
So,
but you have to make sure your team shows up and is excited. But even if you get every Republican vote in the state of Minnesota, that'll get you to about 43%, 42%, maybe. And then you got to go get your share of the independents and maybe even some Democrats who are not yet Republicans, because if you just get the Republicans, there's not enough of them to win the election. So you got to be the kind of candidate who can motivate and inspire the Republican base so that they turn out in a non-presidential year. And then you also have to be the kind of candidate who can also attract support from some non-Republicans. I've demonstrated an ability to do that.
Absolutely. And when you're running this time around, it does become pretty apparent that we will probably have to eclipse 50% this time. Would you agree?
Yeah, although
with
there's
that?
always some minor parties, even if there isn't a significant third-party candidate. Sometimes there's a Green Party candidate or a Libertarian Party candidate or this or that. So there's a few percentage points, even in a normal year, that sort of get, I don't want to say siphoned away, but redistributed. So you could win maybe with 48 or 49% under that kind of scenario.
When you jumped in, it was fascinating. I am a student of politics, but I'm also a student of Twitter, all right? When you jumped in, it was fascinating to watch both on some of your opponents on this side of the aisle, and then some of these other kind of special interest groups who really started to dump advertising into this race. And it talked a lot about, well, if Tim Pawlenty is the candidate, this election is going to be more about the past than it is about the future. Diametrically to that, you have been speaking about the future in your career since working for the Roundtable. What do you say to those people? How do you combat that type of message?
Well, the record, in my view, especially for Republicans, is really good. Here's what we did. We appointed for the first time in the modern history of the state a common sense conservative Minnesota Supreme Court. I cut taxes as governor and as majority leader. We held state spending when I was governor to the lowest level in 4 decades. We imposed work requirements in welfare before that was the popular thing to do. We drove market-based, not government-based, healthcare reforms. We cracked down on illegal immigration in a variety of ways, including putting status check right on the driver's license of people who are overstaying their visas, and the list goes on. So again, if you are at all center or center-right or Republican or conservative or libertarian, that group would say that's a pretty good record. So I have no problem running on that record. That's a good record, I think, from a conservative or Republican standpoint. But also people want to know, what are you going to do going forward? And what we're going to do going forward is find ways to bring down health care premiums, because that's what's squeezing people in middle-income Minnesotans. We're going to make sure that we have school reform so that we have the people who are being left behind due to lack of education or lack of skill come out of school ready for the workforce of tomorrow. And then we're also going to lower government burdens in the form of taxation, but all of that geared towards middle-income Minnesotans. The wealthy are going to be, more or less fine. We have relatively good social service programs already in Minnesota. The people who are getting squeezed in healthcare, lack of education or skills in terms of what's relevant for today's economy and taxes are the hardworking middle-income folks, and that's where we're going to focus our campaign and my time as governor.
How do you specifically tackle the healthcare challenge? I read an article the other day that talked a lot about how out of whack health and human service spending is in Minnesota, and it seems embedded. It seems like nothing can change it. You have been in the mire, all right, of St. Paul in government. Where do you even begin?
Yeah, it's complicated, and most people's eyes glaze over once you get 60 seconds into it. It would include this. First of all, stop wasting the money we already spend. Legislative audit report came out a couple of years ago that said that Minnesota doesn't even check or is incompetent in checking whether people are eligible for our public programs that we're having to pay for people in terms of their health care and some other things. And they're up to hundreds of millions of dollars a year wasted and inappropriately and arguably illegally distributed because the bureaucrats don't have the right system or the desire to check whether somebody's actually here legally or whether they even qualify for the program. So number one, stop wasting money. Number two, let's use common sense. When you're in a hospital and they give you a drug and that same drug is available right down the street at Walgreens for a third of the price, you kind of wonder what's going on there that requires the hospitals to overcharge. And I think bringing some fairness and transparency to those kinds of situations is important. But again, there are many, many other things. We need to do medical malpractice reform. We need more competition in the market. But importantly, we need to reestablish patients and consumers as being empowered in the system. Because right now they consume healthcare services, but let's face it, unless you are really dedicated, you don't know really what this stuff costs.
Of course.
You don't know really whether the quality is good or bad compared to some other alternatives. and mostly the bill goes somewhere else and somebody else pays for it. And the person, by the way, who's providing that, the person in the white coat and their employer, gets paid based on what? Volumes of procedures. So if you get paid on volumes of procedures, what do you think you're going to get, Max? Probably more volume.
Of course.
And so we have to think about it in terms of re-empowering consumers with information about price, information about quality, and then give them financial incentives to utilize the system wisely. That's how markets work. That's common sense. That's accountable human behavior. If I say to you, Max, I don't know if you drink or not, you can choose the open bar or the cash bar. I suspect you're going to the open bar. It probably will have one or two extra, as opposed to if you were paying for it yourself.
It depends on if I'm talking to you right after I have those drinks.
That's right.
One thing that is kind of a hot button issue, right, it always is, but we just had these sit-ins at the Capitol today, kind of in regards to gun reform, background checks. We've had the folks on this show from the Gun Owners Caucus a few times in to kind of explain the nuance of some of the regulation in place right now. Do you see that as something that you would address as governor in any meaningful way? Or
well, people have, there's two competing and understandable concerns. One is people like me who are strong Second Amendment supporters and are sensitive and aware about gun owner rights and the history underneath all of that and the importance of that in terms of personal security, self-defense, the great outdoors and the great sporting community that we have in Minnesota connected to that. And then also people want to be able to go to schools and movie theaters and should expect their kids and their loved ones can go do that in a safe way. So these two groups, are understandably concerned about their perspective and what's left to be done. The people who are perpetrating gun violence in many cases have mental health or chemical dependency or other challenges. And I think we have to focus on making sure that we're doing all we can to address and see those challenges before they become, manifest themselves in violence. And there's a whole agenda around increasing mental health capacity appropriately with due process, identifying individuals who are in those situations and need help sooner. I think there's a whole agenda around school safety and making our schools more secure and safe, ranging from simple things like having school marshals at the discretion and choice of local schools, not necessarily arming teachers, but people who perhaps could help with additional security, and making the perimeter more secure, things like a single point of entry. As to guns themselves, Minnesota already has a 21-year-old requirement for handguns, as does the nation. Of all the murders in 2016 in Minnesota, there's about 200 of them, give or take. 2 of them were committed with a long rifle, and neither one of those was a so-called assault weapon. Golf clubs, knives, other blunt instruments and objects, and handguns too, were what's perpetrated most of those homicides. So if you really want to talk about how do you reduce violence, it has very little to do with long rifles. It has a lot to do with those other instruments. And for Minnesota and the country, if you're a licensed firearm dealer, you have to run a background check. But the background check is only as good as the data people put into it. And so I think the Congress, for once, they did something wise.
You said it. Not me.
They put some time and energy and effort into fixing the system that is the background check system. In other words, people have to put the data in there. In other words, if I check on you and you're in the criminal system somewhere else and your conviction is missing, that doesn't do us a lot of good. So they're fixing that. That's a good step. I also think you could do some other things in terms of the background check, not by making it impede people's ability to do gifts or donations to loved ones. But the people who fall between gifts and donations to loved ones and licensed firearm dealers are these so-called private sales. And one of the things that happens that we need to crack down are so-called straw person sales. They used to call them straw man sales. But these are folks who present themselves as a legal buyer of a gun, knowing ahead of time they're actually going to transfer it to somebody else who's got perhaps other motives. And I think making sure we do what we can to reduce those so-called straw man sales would be important as well.
You talk a lot about the fourth industrial revolution. It's a talk that I find personally interesting, being in the business of web development and digital marketing and whatever happens next. How much of that is going to be part of this campaign?
That's more futuristic, Max, in the sense that it is coming. Because you're in it. You understand that the next generation of technology is going to have profound impacts on our economy, our culture, our workforce, the training and work that goes into getting ready for the workforce. But this campaign is going to happen in the next 6 months.
Of course.
And much of what you and I like to talk about in terms of technology and its impact, in terms of its real impact,
right,
it's probably not going to set in for 3 to 10 years. And so you can't get too far ahead of yourself. But I'm aware of it. I follow it. I'm a student of it like you. But it does begin to reshape how you think about things like, what does the future of transportation look like in a world where there's self-driving cars, and you think about fixed rail passenger capacity. Is that even relevant in the future in terms of it being outdated technology,
right,
going to point A to point B at great expense when you're going to have, total customization and probably on-demand ability to move around using summonable autonomous vehicles. There's a whole set of changes that are coming because of virtual reality and customized learning that can be brought into education. You think about healthcare, what you're going to be able to do yourself on your phone in the future.
Right.
Take your blood pressure, take your heart rate, run your EKG, you already can. They're working on tests where you can spit on your phone or put a drop of blood on your phone and run a full saliva test and blood test, all from your kitchen table. They're working on technology to allow your phone to be able to do an ultrasound on yourself if you want to,
right,
and upload it to your doctor without ever leaving
right,
your kitchen. And as you know, once you bring things to scale and you get economies of scale, price points drop. It's the democratization of medicine, because if you have a phone, everybody can participate or connect. And again, it's not going to solve all of our problems, but you can begin to see how that it will change the healthcare delivery system in the future. But again, these are out there a ways,
of course,
in time, and I think we got to focus more on some of the things that are going to happen in the next 1 to 3 years.
Well, and I think they do shape, like you said about transportation, I also think they shape your message about what does education look like. You talk a lot about the revival of the trades, and there's going to need, with this technology, there's going to need to be a lot of support to both repair it, install it, that kind of thing. I'm concerned about that. Being a young person, whenever you talk to an HVAC contractor or you talk to a plumber, it's never about we don't have enough jobs. It's always about we don't have the people to fill the labor behind it. I'm curious as to your take about how much you think that is a lack of preparation and how much you think that maybe it's a lack of will for people like me to go find those jobs.
You put your finger on something that is just so important, Max. We made a mistake, I think. You're younger than me, but in my lifetime, they took technical and vocational training mostly out of the high schools. I think that was a big mistake. I don't think we want to tell people that you must be in a certain field, but I think we need to do a much better job showing and offering alternatives to just a 4-year college degree, and specifically vocational and technical training in the high schools that's modern and relevant, as an alternative pathway, voluntary, and making sure that that continues in our technical colleges across Minnesota, and that there's good synergy in terms of cross-institution credit, curriculum coordination and alignment. And I would also offer incentives for private sector employers to offer apprenticeships, so people coming out of high school or those technical programs are more likely to easily transition into the workforce. Half the people who go to college nationally don't graduate. 50% drop out. Of the ones who do drop out, they're usually massively in debt, and oftentimes do not get a job that's any better paying than the 2-year technical college or credentialed skilled trade person. So we need to do all of that, but also at the same time celebrate and value those skilled trade jobs. They are important. And then very lastly, for people who are able-bodied and able-minded, we have to encourage them to get skilled and work. We have a lot of folks who could fill some of these jobs, even though we have low unemployment, who are saying they don't want the job because they think it might be too hard, or it's easier to, perhaps receive certain benefits from the government as opposed to actually working. Again, if you're able-bodied and you're able-minded, we should have an expectation that you're either working, looking for work, or training for work.
You talk, backing up a little bit, we talked about fixed rail transportation. Being governor is a hard job. You had a lot of fixed rail constructed under your tenure as governor. Is that a commitment to looking at futuristic technologies for our transportation? Because when I ran in 2016, there was a lot of people still focused on, we need to get Southwest done, we need to get this federal money for light rail. How do you deal with it? It seems like this inevitability of government that they are going to install their light rail and that there is no system that can stop it.
Well,
what do you do about it?
Yeah, I think what you do is this, Bex. You say as the leader, the person who has a lot of influence in the final decision, we got to put every project of any form, and increasingly technology is going to change what the form is, to these tests. How many people is it going to move? How much does it cost to build? How much does it cost to operate once it's up and running? How does that compare to other alternatives? And then let's make sure we're using the most efficient and effective option. And as we go forward with autonomous or self-driving vehicles and what that means for transportation and what the future of transportation looks like, I highly doubt that the future is going to be 1950s technology, i.e. really expensive fixed rail trains running from point A to point B with lots of stops. And I believe that the next generation of discussion will have very little to do with fixed rail.
Technology
on passenger trains.
Yeah, and talking about a technology of a different kind, specifically our energy initiatives in Minnesota, kind of the last policy point that I wanted to cover with you today. We talked about how the path to victory, we think outstate Minnesota, there's been a good path for us to really win people who we have not been able to win in the past 50 years. I think a lot of that has to do with our willingness to drill and mine and be open to different energy sources within our natural resources up in outstate Minnesota. The first time you were governor, there was some kind of cap and trade rhetoric that happened. You got hammered on it when you ran for president. What is your position on that now, if it's changed at all?
Well, a ton has changed since I was last in office and first ran for office. And at that time, especially if you go back to 2002, we were worried about what was called peak oil, peak gas. Even T. Boone Pickens, who was a very prominent
Love that name.
Oil and gas guy, was talking about peak oil. And what happened? And there was value in trying to diversify America and Minnesota's energy portfolio because we were hooked to very dangerous other countries, addicted to them and their oil. And that created national security concerns, created efficiency concerns, and it put us at risk in terms of their ability to control price and put America, I think, in a very vulnerable position. Since all of that happened, there's been a new technology that has revolutionized American energy, and it's called horizontal drilling. And some refer to it as fracking, but this has...
you can't use that word. That word doesn't pull well.
If you do, you have to make sure you enunciate it correctly.
Can't use that, can't use voucher, okay?
But horizontal drilling has unleashed an American energy revolution where we have gone to a past that I just described to something now where we have enough oil and gas in this country to last your lifetime, my lifetime for sure, and probably our kids and our grandkids. And the natural gas part of that burns, even for baseload energy, more cleanly, but it's abundant, economical, efficient, and it's in the U.S. So a lot of the pressure off of diversifying the energy portfolio is off. And so I think we now have a whole different discussion around American energy and what's best, what's available, what's here, what's reliable, and what's efficient. All of that being said, for our Republican friends who are viewing this, keep in mind, all energy is subsidized. The nuclear energy industry was researched, developed, and commercialized by the United States government. It's a government technology that paid for. Oil and gas has significant subsidies in the tax code in the form of exploration and various other credits, exemptions, and deductions. So that's subsidized. And of course, various forms of renewable energy is subsidized as well. So as we talk about let the market work, let's make sure we put all the subsidies on the table and that we're really looking apples to apples. But the short answer to your question is we really have a future that is based on American energy and the plentiful energy power that is going to be available through horizontal drilling. And the rest of it is potentially helpful, but more and more we have to say it has to stand, all of it has to stand on its own economic legs.
Governor Tim Pawlenty, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people go to find out a little bit more about your campaign?
TimPawlenty.com, that's our website, and we hope people will check that out and join our team.
That's an easy one.
Yeah, thank
Thanks.
you. Thanks, Max.
This has been the Republican Roundtable. I'm Max Reimer. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.